This situation comes up all the time in RPGs. You've captured one of the villain's minions and you want to know what they know. You want to get information out of them. In movies, literature, and in some video games, interrogation scenes are ones of high drama. The inherent tension of the protagonist wanting something that the antagonist doesn't necessarily want to give up plays out excitingly through the dialogue, and threats of violence and occasional violence. The problem is, at least for me, I've never really had an interrogation scene that makes you go, wow. I've never really had a really memorable interrogation scene in one of my D&D games. I don't think I'm alone in that. I think a lot of people want an oral duel of wits, but most of the time their interrogation scenes end up falling flat. So in this video, I'm gonna try to figure out why that is and what are some things that we can do better as DMs to make our interrogations more interesting and memorable. And at the end of this video, I'm also gonna share a way to do this through the rules, a rules hack. That is, I'm gonna take an existing piece of the D&D rules and then use it in a new application in a different area of the game. And we're gonna see how that works out. In interrogation scenes in traditional media, the writer is the one that controls the release of information because they can script both the interrogator and the interrogatee. This allows them complete control of the rising and release of tension because they're the ones that are controlling the back and forth. It's usually built in the form of suspense. Suspense is a special type of tension. Tension can come from uncertainty, open conflict, and all sorts of different things. But suspense is usually a binary between whether or not option A or option B will happen. If this or if not this. Will Officer Nash name names to Mr. Blonde? Will Colonel Landa find out about the Jewish family? Will Batman learn where Harvey is in time? Will he kill the Joker? But in tabletop RPGs, because they don't have a script, the players don't necessarily pool the narrative into this situational dichotomy. Instead, these at their mercy interrogations tend to mimic a lot of other roleplay scenes, usually with equal amounts of violence. And in scripted scenes, the questioner usually knows what information they are after. And then when the subject reveals some shocking new bit of information, the questioner is forced to an unplanned series of questions, which leads to rising drama. But the majority of my RPG experience, the norm is the players are trying to figure out what they want to ask as they are questioning. They'll stop and have to think about plot points that might matter, misremember some details, and, from the DM's point of view, waste a lot of time on irrelevant lines of questioning. This leads to the players feeling frustrated, and that feeling of just spinning wheels is what usually leads to the last act, the torture and execution of the prisoner, which is almost as boring as detect thoughts. But here's the thing, detect thoughts specifically says that's useful in interrogations. So if you just have your minions always empty their minds and have nothing useful, then you sort of defeated the purpose of that spell. The same thing with suggestion. People are always complaining about magic, but your players chose those spells because they wanted them to be useful. And so you as a storyteller, you need to find new ways to incorporate the tool so your players feel rewarded for thinking ahead while not ruining all your intrigue. Normally, I'm a pretty improv heavy DM, but in this case, I think the best thing we can do is plan to set our players up for success. If we want to have a good interrogation scene, we have to give their players the necessary components in order to have one. Interrogations are about information, obviously about getting information out of somebody. But what might not be immediately obvious is that interrogations are also equally about what information you already have. One important point is that while interrogations are usually their own scene, they are not an isolated event. They are part of a larger investigation, which means that your players already need to have some mystery, some clue, some uncertainty, and some information before they can have an effective interrogation. In terms of adventure design, this means that you need to gate your information-holding minions behind a place or a scene where the players can collect pertinent information. Only after the players find the body with the hastily scribbled note do they find the newest acolyte to the cult. The two bandits are arguing loudly and dropping hints as you are sneaking up on them. Then, when narrating the setup to the interrogation scene, you as DM, you need to add a little bit to the fiction, either through dialogue or just plain narration that sets up an if or else scenario. Purposefully highlighting the potential stakes of the interrogation, I think, will do a whole lot to add to the suspense. So taking the time to dress up the scene and really set the stakes with your players will hopefully make these interrogation scenes a lot more dramatic. And I think the last thing you can do to set your players up for success is, as a DM, really think about what the minion knows. And we're gonna go into that a lot more detail in the rules hacking. Another problem I see when dealing with interrogations is there is a lot of use of the same two tropes. The softie who will fold and reveal everything, and the hardened badass who will reveal nothing. Now, neither of those are a problem per se. The problem comes when that's all that you have. It gets dull and stale and doesn't add a whole lot of texture to your game. The poor kid who got in over her head and the goblin who has no loyalty and just wants to get out are both examples of the first type. And those are used primarily for exposition. The DM needs a way to get information to the players, and this is a convenient and logical way to do it. The other kind is the tough as nails thug, the cult fanatic. These usually pop up when the players have unexpectedly captured somebody. They've caught the DM off guard, and the DM really wants to try to keep some information secret. So none of these examples are problematic per se, and by themselves they work as a good bit of filler or a useful tool for your game. The problem is when all of your minions fall starkly into those two categories, because people are rarely so binary. Even the poor kid will downplay their own guilty acts, and the hardened loyalist can boast to show off his group's power or his own strength and influence. So the trick is to figure out what each individual minion wants to reveal and what they want to keep quiet about. And so again, this is another bit that we're going to throw into our rules hacking section. The other way to avoid the all or nothing interrogation scene is the use of misdirection. Guess what? Nobody has perfect information, and low-level minions almost certainly have a lot of misinformation. They have rumors that they've heard or things that they're trying to convince themselves are true. Even if they are cooperating, what they're saying may not be 100% just the facts. Everybody has their own point of view and perspective, things that they attach more weight to than others, and things they're initially trying to convince themselves to believe. One way for a clever minion to use misdirection, or even to show their own power or arrogance, is in dialogue, have them respond to a question not with an answer, but with a tangent, an aside, something that is seemingly unrelated but still interesting to the PC. As long as what the subject is saying is compelling or interesting, even if it isn't exactly what the Inquisitor initially wanted, they are likely to continue to listen. The subject can wrap up their anecdote with a point that was tangential to what was initially asked. And if it was delivered correctly with a little bit of intrigue, then the questioner may ask more about that, and hence they avoided the question while seemingly complying. One of the things they teach you in anti-interrogation training is to try to remember what it was like to be a teenager. When your parents would ask you, "Where are you going?" "Out." "With whom?" "Friends." You're giving technically true answers, but you are delaying, stalling for time, hoping that the questioner will get bored. This delaying tactic can get old, so use it sparingly. And when you do use it, I think you should pair it with a time-sensitive event. So these delay tactics aren't just a mere pest, they're a real danger. Those ideas are the answers to all of the "but what about magic" type questions. A charmed minion, of course, they're gonna play up their organization's power to their new friend. They wanna seem cool. Or they might downplay some of the nastier bits they were involved with, so they don't want the scorn of their new friend. Yeah, a charmed person will be easier to get information out of, but very few of us are utterly open and honest with anybody, much less just a casual pal. And suggestion is probably gonna yield a tangential response, something seemingly related to the question, and a dominated person will certainly give the truth, if only from their own point of view. So there's all sorts of ways we can richly incorporate magic into our storytelling without it being this automatic "I win" type button. There is always one. Sometimes it's the character, sometimes it's the player, but there's always somebody who will resort to beating, chopping off fingers, breaking bones, and all sorts of other nastiness to get the captured minion to cooperate. And then once they've gotten what they think is all the information out of them, well, that minion has exhausted their usefulness. Let's just kill them. Now your group of heroes, if they haven't done so themselves, they've certainly acquiesced to some pretty evil stuff. And I don't think the majority of players really like that, at least not most of the time. When the question of torture does come up in the middle of your scene, it's gonna break your flow. You're gonna have this weird moment when one player says, "I cut off his foot," and another player's like, "What? No." And then you have this weird clash where you're not sure if it's the players arguing or if it's the characters arguing about the ethics of maiming this NPC right in front of them. So there's gotta be something we can do to sort of stop this absurdity bomb from happening. I hate those little moments of dissonance that break the verisimilitude. So I think the best thing we can do to avoid it and set up some dramatic potential is talk to the players ahead of time about what their boundaries are, about how far they're willing to go in a scene. Before the interrogation starts, as DM, You can prompt an aside to talk out of character or create a specific RP scene where the limits of what they're willing to do is established. Establishing these constraints gives you a dramatic framework, a structure for which you can build your story in. A simple way to avoid torture is to have your NPCs act like folks in the real world do. If threatened, have them say anything that they think will help them avoid punishment. When the interrogator resorts to torture, the subject will say whatever they think will stop it, regardless of the truth. You can condition your players to accept that this avenue won't work. Tell me where the diamonds are or I'll kill you won't get you the truth if the truth is, I don't know. Instead, the subject will say, it's buried at the other hideout. Or, if your group's okay with it, something you can do is have torture not work by brute force, but only have torture work if it's part of a cunning plan. If the players ask a question they already know the answer to, and the subject lies, they chop off a finger. Next, they'll ask the subject a question that the person is probably willing to give the answer to, and then wait and see if they tell the truth. If they tell the truth, no finger gets chopped off. Finally, the players ask a question of the subject that they don't know the answer to, and the subject does not want to give information on. Will they tell a truth or a lie? Do they believe the threat about getting their fingers chopped off? That is when you call for an intimidation roll, after all that work has been done. So in that particular instance, threats of violence and actual violence seem to be effective. The 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide is probably the best RPG book that no one has ever read. I mean, how many DMs can honestly say they've read the whole thing from cover to cover? I think most of us just look in it when there's something specific that we're after, which means if you do read it cover to cover, it's full of cool surprises. In this case, there's a little rule that we're going to hack. We're gonna take this rule and use it in a way that's not intended to get a useful outcome, and then we're gonna dress it up a bit just to suit our purposes. So the rule we're gonna use is loyalty. It goes something like this. An NPC has a loyalty score equal to half the highest party member's charisma score. If you help them fulfill their bonds, their loyalty score increases by 1d4. If you hinder their goals, decrease it by 1d4, and you decrease it by 2d4 if you did it like cruelly or capriciously. An NPC with a loyalty score of 0 is disloyal to the party. However, an NPC with a loyalty score of 10 will risk life and limb to help the party out. So some of you folks can probably already guess where I'm going with this. We're gonna use the loyalty rules and reskin it as cooperation. A minion will start with a cooperation score equal to half the highest party member's charisma. The next thing you're gonna do is roll on the what the minions know table. It's probably best to make a new table for each adventure, but I'll link this generic one in the video description below. So here's the key bit. The minion knows everything equal to the result or lower on the table, but they will only reveal information if their cooperation score is equal to or lower that information. So the minion might know something that they don't want to talk about, and you can get them to talk about it by raising their cooperation score. When the party is interrogating the minion and they reach a point where what they want to know is greater than the minion's cooperation score, then you can try to adjust the score by having them make an ability check. The DC is going to be equal to 8 plus the charisma modifier plus the proficiency bonus of the minion, and if the party succeeds on persuasion, intimidation, whatever, then you can increase the minion's cooperation by 1d4 and hence their ability to reveal new information, their willingness to reveal new information. And on a fail, you decrease it by 1d4. Another thing to consider is that bandits became bandits for a reason, and so did each individual cultist. NPCs are people too, which means that they have traits, they have personalities and bonds and flaws. So what I did is I made a minion table, with some of them suggesting specific repercussions for interrogation techniques. That is, if you interrogate them in ways that resonate with their bonds and flaws, you can gain advantage or disadvantage on particular roles to influence them. For example, if a bandit only joined the gang in order to feed his baby, promising him money may make him a lot more willing to cooperate and reveal information. In contrast, if a cultist believes that the cult will go and murder his whole family, you'd have to convince them that you're gonna wipe out the whole organization before they begin to talk. Yeah, I think that's it. That's the video, folks. This was a pretty long one. This is a new style. Normally I give advice on things that I know will work. These are just the ideas that I've had that I think will work. There's not a whole lot of information out there about interrogations, so let me know what you think about it in the comments below. If you want a sneak peek at the project I've been working on, there's a link to the sign up in the video description.